Good. Okay, well, I think we've got enough. So welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth, Executive Director, AII Victoria. Thank you all for joining us on an unusual morning session for us, but that's because our speaker is kindly joining us from Washington, D.C, where it's Wednesday evening, her time. We'll take questions towards the end, so as you can put them in the Q&A tab. So to discuss Washington's rediscovery of the Pacific and the Pacific Island Summit that was held by President Biden in the White House just recently, we're joined by Associate Professor Patricia O'Brien. Patty is faculty in the Asian Studies program at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. She teaches on Pacific pasts, presents, and futures. She's also a visiting fellow with the Department of Pacific Affairs at ANU Canberra, where she was an Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the School of History from 2014 to 2019. And she's very widely published on Pacific affairs. So Patty, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand over to you. I'll see you at the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Alistair, for the invitation, and really nice to sort of get beamed into Melbourne. I wish I was there in person. Yeah, love Melbourne, and hi to everyone in Melbourne and other places in Australia and elsewhere. And I'm sorry to, start your morning off, disrupt the schedule. But anyway, such are the logistics of time zones. Okay, so I'll begin. While Hurricane Ian provided a devastating illustration of the terrible costs of climate change on September 28th, leaders from 14 Pacific nations and territories gathered in Washington for a historic summit where climate action was top of the agenda. The juxtaposition of Hurricane Ian in Florida, where the death toll and devastation put it in the upper echelons of storms that have hit the US, and the gathered chorus of Pacific voices who have been clamoring to be heard for decades about the existential crisis that climate change poses to their home islands, was profoundly poignant. As the documentary Rising Waters put it in the year 2000, the Pacific Islands are the warning system for the world to see. 22 years on, as the rains from Hurricane Ian fell on Washington, D.C. in the days after the Pacific leaders departed, it is now time to take stock of what the summit achieved and what happens next. The Pacific region has achieved a torrent of attention from the US government and China in 2022. The summit represented the culmination of the warp speed US diplomacy and policy development over the past few months. Climate change may have been at the top of the summit agenda because the Pacific Islands Forum has insisted for many years that it is the region's highest priority, a position the Biden administration fully supports. That said, geopolitics is the main driver of US efforts. As President Joe Biden put it to the summit, the security of America, quite frankly, and the world depends on your security and the security of the Pacific Islands. The summit produced several documents outlining how the US proposes to bind itself into the Pacific Islands in new and more deeply using existing programs and structures. During the summit, the White House released the Pacific Partnership Strategy, also the roadmap for a 21st century US Pacific Island Partnership, and also an 11-point declaration on the US Pacific Partnership that in the end, all parties signed. Before the conference, Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare said he would not sign it. It was reported that Sogavare's resistance was due to language in the declaration that obligated signatories to discuss new security relationships with regional impacts with all parties, a thinly veiled reference to the secret Solomon Islands China Security Agreement signed in April 2022. This language was subsequently removed, so the Solomon Islands and other nations did not have to choose sides. China also was not mentioned in the roadmap document, though the slate of ambitious initiatives to meet Pacific priorities it outlined were all largely aimed at meeting China on numerous levels. The partnership strategy document, however, articulated this great anxiety of geopolitical competition that is fueling the rapid upscaling of US engagement. It plainly noted the increasing instances of, quote, pressures and economic coercion by the People's Republic of China, which risks undermining the peace, prosperity, and security of the region, and by extension of the United States. The summit has provided much to digest and review. One key summit outcome was that the US recognized the Cook Islands and Niue as sovereign states. This was a big development, given that neither country was initially invited to the summit due to their realm state relationship with New Zealand. In recognizing the Cook Islands and Niue, the US was demonstrating they were listening to regional objections when all the members of the Pacific Islands Forum were not offered a seat at the summit table. To this end, France's territories of French Polynesia and New Caledonia were also invited belatedly to Washington. For New Caledonia's pro-independence president, Louis Mapau, his attendance at the summit was a big boost to his cause. As well as these 4 nations and territories, the summit included the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, Nauru, and Vanuatu. Observing proceedings were the ambassadors of Australia and New Zealand and Henry Puna, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General. One big notable absence from the summit was Kiribati, the nation that withdrew from the Pacific Islands Forum mid-2022. As journalist Michael Field put it, President Teneti Mamau is continuing with his hermit kingdom-like behaviour. This is a brewing situation brimming with geopolitical tensions, given Mamau's increasing moves towards the PRC since it began recognising it in September 2019, the same time the Solomon Islands suddenly abandoned Taiwan too. While Kiribati was not at the table, the US has already announced that it will be establishing an embassy in its capital of Tarawa. Currently, the US ambassador to Fiji is also accredited to Kiribati. This development cannot come soon enough, given the geopolitics as well as the growing pressures Mamau is placing on his nation's democratic institutions. Beneath the inspiring statements and shared history that 2 million US citizens call the Pacific Islands home, there was the detail about how the US was going to make good on its repeated pledges to do better in the Pacific. As always, the devil is in the detail, and in this case, it's also in the dollars. The roadmap outlined a substantial increase in the amount of money the US is going to direct towards the region. $810 million is being slated for additional and expanded programs. Of this $810 million, $600 million will go towards programs associated with the South Seas Pacific Tuna Treaty. Since it was first signed in 1987, the Tuna Treaty has been the cornerstone of US support for the Pacific through an associated economic assistance agreement with 16 Pacific nations, including Australia and New Zealand, that allows US vessels to fish in their exclusive economic zones and provides for monitoring, control, and surveillance standards for the region's fisheries, all of which are vital to deterring illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing that costs Pacific nations around $330 million per year in lost revenue. Importantly, according to a US government official, this $810 million does not include money currently under negotiation that would be directed towards the 3 Compact of Free Association states, that is the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Funding for these COFA states accounts for the lion's share, by a vast degree, of all the money the US has directed to the Pacific region over the 40 years since these COFA agreements were signed in the mid-1980s. The roadmap, however, stated that the US has spent $1.5 billion in the Pacific over the past decade, but this includes the funds for COFA states, according to this government official, an inclusion that greatly skews the funding picture. While the 3 COFA agreements that are currently being renegotiated are the bedrock of US-Pacific cooperation for nearly 4 decades, as the partnership strategy states, and make up such a large part of US-Pacific spending, the 3 Pacific parties expressed their frustration before the summit began that the latest agreements fall short on the money. Also, the Marshall Islands halted talks about the COFA agreements because the US had not guaranteed ahead of the summit that costly nuclear legacy funding would be included in their next COFA agreement. Though the summit roadmap predicted the signing of these agreements by the end of 2022, progress to that end may not be smooth. As expected, much US attention was given to programs addressing the climate crisis, clean energy, and sustainable infrastructure. The US pledged over $130 million for these needs, and it will also leverage an additional $400 million in private financing. There was also money for post-COVID economic recovery, more than $50 million, health and security cooperation, maritime protection, and digital connectivity, $3.5 million over 5 years across the region was announced. This last item needs to be contextualized with the immense upcoming Huawei project to install mobile towers in the Solomon Islands. As journalist Georgina Kekia notes, it is being funded by a $100 million loan from the PRC that completely eclipses what the US has put on the table for the region. This line item alone points to an underlying problem of the US package. It does not come close to matching China's investment in the Pacific Islands over the past 15 years. However, American money does not come with the onerous debt obligations much of the Chinese money does. Adding to the dollar-related questions and complexities of the summit is the situation that much of the promised money must go through the convoluted congressional approval process. In an effort to accelerate this process, the Biden administration has already reprogrammed a frozen $130 million approved for Egypt towards the Pacific instead. And I'm sure that there's going to be, where they can, that they'll repeat that. For approving additional funds, the current bipartisan support in Congress for Pacific initiatives bodes well. But with midterm elections due in just over a month on November 8, a changed congressional landscape may impact these final dollar numbers going to the Pacific. Key to success here is making a compelling case to the American public and therefore its representatives for supporting the Pacific Islands. American literacy about the islands is low. Going forward, this presents a significant problem for this upscaled regional engagement, a situation that seems to have gotten some recognition in the rapidly devised summit deliverables. A fact sheet issued by the White House during the summit noted that the government would work to strengthen people-to-people ties by boosting the Peace Corps presence in Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu, as well as offering enhanced educational experiences through student and professional exchanges, enhanced curriculum, and the establishment of Pacific Studies programs in the United States. Though this latter initiative did not appear in the subsequent roadmap, that outlined funding allocations. So how has the summit been received in the Pacific? The Pacific media has been relatively muted. A case in point is the response by Meg Taylor and Solly Middleby, which advocated for a substantial overhaul of assistance delivery and US methods for engagement in the wake of the summit, while offering a sobering regional perspective on geostrategic competition for the US. In contrast, academic Tarsisius Kabutalaka sees an overall positive view of US overtures and their increased assistance, and he was speaking on Pacific Beat the other day. However, he cautions too that these funding has not, a lot of it has not been approved. The Guam Daily Post also makes this point and puts the US commitments to the Pacific in a different perspective. The proposed funding amounts to, as it quotes, 5.4% of the $15 billion granted to Ukraine this year to help defend against invasion and occupation of its cities and towns by Russia, the Guam Daily Post wrote. Caution about the relative scale of commitment compared to China and other US priority areas, and whether the pledges will actualize as promised, hits on historic problems the US has encountered when it has attempted to up its engagement with the Pacific. And this has happened multiple times since the 1980s. In the mid-1980s, geostrategic competition with the USSR prompted the US to negotiate the 3 COFA agreements and also the Tuna Treaty. The Triennial Pacific Islands Conference of Leaders, known as the PICL, also began in Honolulu in 1980, and this is a family photo of the PICL that happened in September. In 1990, then US President George H.W. Bush, who had a long personal history with the region dating back to his war service, attended the PICL. He spoke warmly of the Pacific Islands as an aquatic continent and America's place in the extended family of Pacific nations. Friction at this conference revolved around the US plan to use Johnston Atoll to incinerate large stocks of chemical munitions from Europe as a significant step towards peace and disarmament, Bush argued, though he had to assure that concerned Pacific leaders that there would be no associated environmental damage. But despite this presidential presence at the PICL, over the next 17 years, US engagement in the region faltered to the point that the State Department declared 2007 the year of the Pacific because, quote, it is crucial to keep this vast strategic region and its mostly small, sometimes struggling states firmly on our side. The government initiatives in 2007 were intended to reverse any perception that the US had withdrawn from the Pacific. A new geostrategic contest was now in play, with scholar Kevin Stringer asking at the time if Pacific Island microstates were pawns or players in Pacific Rim diplomacy. The struggle for influence between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, as well as fishing issues with Japan, were the catalyst for this new competition, Stringer said. The Year of the Pacific involved devising, quote, a whole of government approach to expand our activities in the region, in language closely resembling that used by US officials in 2022. In 2007, the government made very modest funding pledges due to extensive budget cuts, with the US spending less than $190 million in the region in 2006. Of that $190 million, $150 million was money that was directed towards the COFA countries of the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. As Congressman Eni Falimavena of American Samoa noted at the time, while the US was spending $20 billion a month on the war in Iraq, it was spending less than $40 million a year across the entire non-COFA Pacific, and that this gave the US very little traction in the region. But as part of the effort, the PICL was held in Washington, D.C. in May 2007, and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was the highest ranking attendee. President George W. Bush did not attend the PICL, unlike his father 17 years before, a move that Falimavena described as discourteous. Despite the good intentions and efforts of State Department officials 15 years ago, the 2007 US re-engagement with the Pacific Islands again faltered. Why? There was the drastic impacts of the global financial crisis from 2008 and the ongoing drain on US coffers with Middle East conflicts. In the Pacific, the reasons were multifaceted. According to Ambassador C. Stephen McGann, who represented the US as head of mission in Fiji, Nauru, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Tonga from 2008 to 2011, he said that the US did not anticipate that the competition between Beijing and Taipei for diplomatic recognition would escalate so quickly. China was able to aggressively put resources into the region, particularly as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, faster than the US executive and legislative branches could respond. Added to this was the impacts of climate change and key issues such as fisheries protection, economic diversification, migration law enforcement, gender-based violence, and healthcare infrastructure that were not seen as regional instability indicators, said McGann. On top of all these factors has been the escalation of the military dimension, which rapidly expanded from the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea into the South Pacific with the 2022 China-Solomon Islands security deal. So why is the 2022 US Pacific push going to be different? One cause for optimism is that the US is joining forces through the partners in the Blue Pacific, announced in June 2022 with Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, Japan, and since the UN General Assembly in September, Germany and Canada have also stated their intent to join too. While pooling resources will be a great boost to US aims and also, the Pacific Islands as well, the question remains how these complex efforts will be coordinated in the notoriously complicated setting for delivery of services that the Pacific Islands entails. There is a very strong need for Pacific-based and Pacific-led entities to orchestrate these complex challenges if they are going to work and be sustained over the long term. The Pacific Partners Strategy and the partners in the Blue Pacific initiatives can only work if US and Pacific Islands priorities remain aligned as they currently are with the Biden administration's emphasis on climate action. The considerable variable is what happens when the Republican Party assumes control of one or all of branches of government again. This could occur as early as just over a month's time with the midterm elections that could deliver a Republican majority in the House of Representatives and also the Senate. While many Republicans strongly support the Pacific Islands in Congress, led by Amua Amata Coleman Radewagen, she's in the front right in a purple pulatasi of American Samoa, the stated party position on climate change is at great odds with that of the Pacific. Nowhere is this clearer than in the red state of Florida, currently reeling from Hurricane Ian and where Governor Ron DeSantis is shaping up to be a leading contender to be the Republican presidential candidate in 2024. Articulating the party's public stance, DeSantis recently described global warming concerns as left-wing stuff and has eschewed investing in green technologies and energy. The impacts of climate change were patently clear in Florida well before Hurricane Ian made landfall on September 28, killing more than 100 people according to the latest grim tally, and inflicting a staggering sum of $50 billion in damages in both Florida and another red state, North Carolina. DeSantis has invested in protecting coastlines against the impacts of rising seas through projects like the statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience plan. But Hurricane Ian has demonstrated the futility of such measures. Given the utmost importance of the Pacific Islands to US security, with both political parties in agreement on this point, and given that robust climate action is not negotiable for the Pacific Islands, it is very conceivable that the Republican Party will have to accept that climate action is not left-wing stuff if it wants to continue to advance US relations with the Pacific region. A drastically changing climate does not pick sides in the Pacific geostrategic contest either, between the US and China. As Samoa's Prime Minister Fiame Naomi Mataafa has said, the international community must come together to tackle climate change in an implicit message to both the US and China. The Pacific Islands are uniquely placed to draw the two sides back to the negotiating table since talks between them were suspended last year. And all Pacific parties should use the heightened attention from the US and China to this vital end. The challenge for the US is to not only meet the challenge of working with China, but to also stay the course with its Pacific Islands ambitions and not get blown off track, as it has done at great cost before. Thank you.
Patty, thank you very much for such a detailed presentation. Maybe what I might do is just get you to stop your screen share, and then people can see us a bit better.
Stop my screen share, right.
Yeah, there you go. No, excellent. Thank you very much. Really, really detailed and informative presentation there. So there's a couple of questions that we'll get to, but just starting off, I think, I mean, looking from our perspective in Australia to sort of our neighborhood in a way, has there been any feeling in the US that Australia and I suppose New Zealand have sort of taken their eye off the ball a bit and necessitating the US to step in?
No one's saying that publicly. That you will never hear a bad word about Australia in Washington. I mean, the public script. I mean, there is a massive warmth of feeling between the US, Australia, and New Zealand as well. But the AUKUS agreement, of course, is what is keeping a lot of people busy in Washington, as it is in Canberra. But so no one's saying that, but obviously that is the reality, that the Solomon Islands China agreement was sort of like the line in the sand where the US sort of realized that they've come up very short and they haven't got a lot of resources to turn things around, and that's why that things have changed so rapidly over the past few months.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned AUKUS, and that was going to be another of my questions. Do you have any feeling as to how AUKUS is being viewed within the Pacific Islands, and is it seen as a negative or positive or indifferent?
Well, I think again, people are, they're careful about what they say in public. Obviously, some people have, and of course, it's not a unity of voices. The person who's spoken out about it the most is Sogavare, and he constantly references that. The fact that it was a secret agreement, gives him leverage for the secret agreement that he signed with China, and China obviously talks about AUKUS all the time as well. So, but other people have been, expressed concern about the nuclear dimensions of AUKUS, but generally, I think people, leaders in the Pacific are, they haven't come out and been critical about it, which. But I'm sure there's opinions, but they're being very careful about what they say in public.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question from Zoom. The East-West Center in Honolulu suggested last year that visa-free access, more than just a guest worker program into the US, was going to provide more support to Pacific Islanders directly, and will build cultural ties at a people-to-people level. So have you got any thoughts on that, in visa-free access as opposed to purely guest worker access?
Well, I have to say that before the summit, when there was a lot of talk about the big deliverables that the US was going to put on the table, I thought that a big change to visas was going to be one of them. I thought that there was going to be an expansion of the kind of access into the United States that the COFA nations have. And I was actually very, I thought it was a great opportunity. I mean, I think Australia should do the same thing, that there should be this, a total overhaul of the visa arrangements with the Pacific Islands. And I was a bit disappointed that wasn't there. I thought that was the big thing. But as I'm sure you know, immigration is it's the third rail in the United States. Probably more of a contentious issue than climate change, and so they didn't go there. I'm sure they thought about it, but they didn't, and I think that's a real shame. I thought that was going to be the big deliverable, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. Another question is, how seriously can we take the declaration of partnership? And in the joint communique, the US pledges support for the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, but it's the only major nuclear weapon state refusing to ratify the protocols. The question is the rules-based order falling at the first hurdle?
Yeah, look, the thing with the document, I mean, these things have been done, as I said, at warp speed, these documents. There's a lot of things where you read them and you just think that's not right, but there's, it's an aspirational document rather than something that's reflecting sort of a considered reality. And I think that's another, case in point about that. One thing that stood out to me in the declaration was, I think, wording about the Pacific being a peaceful region for the past 80 years. And, I've heard other US officials say the same thing, which to me is, it's not reflected in reality. Anyone who's sort of spent a few minutes just sort of like going through what the history of the Pacific has been over the past, say 50 years or something. There's been a lot of conflict. I mean, I'm not telling anyone who's probably listening in any news here, but it is news to a lot of people. And I think that so the thing is that those documents, I think, are sort of like a best attempt at putting some aspirational ideas down together and also reflecting back at the Pacific things that they want to hear. But I think the document also shows that the US has to do a lot of work in order to catch up to the Pacific and get up to speed with, the Pacific reality. And I think that, that's probably another case about that.
Australia, of course, announced its own Pacific step up a couple of years ago. And I was interested what you were saying about the partners in the Blue Pacific program then. So two questions. To what extent is that interfacing with Australia's Pacific step up, for example? And the second thing, just interesting that Germany and Canada are part of it. Yes. Does France, as a Pacific nation, not have a role to play in that?
I think France will probably will come into the fold as well. I mean, I think that they're probably, I thought they would come in. I mean, there's some interesting politics going on, again, behind the scenes with France. I mean, the fact that French Polynesia New Caledonia came to Washington, that they flew, that their flags were there, that it's given a boost to the pro-independence movement in New Caledonia. So you just wonder about the politics happening there. I did note that in that sort of family photo, the French flag is also there. So the French are, they are there. But in what kind of, level, we don't know. But, I'm sure the US was treading very carefully there, given that the strain in the relationship because of AUKUS last year. So the question about, the question was about the interface with Australia.
Yes, the Pacific.
Yeah, well, that's the one thing that everyone wants to know. How are all these, really complicated programs and systems, and every country's got their own sort of way of delivering into the Pacific, like how are these things all going to work? And that's something that we don't know. And no one's kind of explained that yet. So that's why I was sort of like saying that we need to have Pacific people organized in. I think, one of the US strategies, from what I understand, is to build up more of a base in Suva for US aid. But then how does that work with the other partners? I don't know. There's going to be a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions on the economic challenges. That, I mean, the region is still suffering from low employment, poor infrastructure. What can the US do in terms of facilitating economic and then social upgrades? I mean, are they going to be able to get US corporations involved in tendering for projects and investing, do you think? And the follow-on was, what is China likely to do in response after their investments?
Right. Yes. China. I think. Okay. What can the US do? I mean, I think that the US has to. There has to be. I mean, there has to be much more. Philanthropic foundation investment in the Pacific. The Gates Foundation. Those kind of enterprises that are. That have not really been involved in the Pacific. So I think that those are the kind of things that the Biden administration really has to work with, those, that huge sector. But in terms of jobs, I think, I really think that, I've been advocating for, using or deploy, really capitalizing on existing people and companies and entrepreneurs in the Pacific who are doing development stuff, that it's really beneficial. I think that the US doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, that there are people operating, but they can give more support to people so they can, they can build the capacity. They also have to do things like, create markets. So people who are, in their village, in their homes, who are building, crafts and those kind of things which they use to boost their income. That creating markets for that kind of thing, I think, is very important. And a little bit will go a long way in a lot of places. So I think that they need to, and I think that the Biden administration's been very strong about trying to direct a lot of their efforts towards women. And I think so, cottage industries are a very important way of doing that. But I think having, providing more opportunities, allowing people to move for work, those kind of things, I think, are really important. And so there's a whole lot of things that they can do, and it's sort of like hard to kind of list them because it's so complicated. But they need to work on a whole lot of levels. Yeah. But I really think even just simple things like creating markets where Pacific goods can get brought in and people can, just buy things as you do if you go, to the Pacific, that if those things can get bought, if there's a way of accessing those things, that will make a big difference in the short term.
Another factor is how they will ensure that the large sums they're talking about investing, how is that really going to benefit the people in the islands versus spending a lot of money hiring external experts who come in and tell them what to do?
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I think they need to just keep the bureaucracies lean. That they need to use people who are already operating without all the the big expensive line items that sort of like make things expensive, planes and transports and all those kind of things. That I think that's going to be the challenge to make sure that it stays focused and targeted, and it helps the people that it really needs. So yeah, that's going to be the big challenge: how to sort of scale it to the right size for the Pacific, and obviously different situation in different Pacific nations. So yeah, that's going to be the big challenge for sure.
Yeah, that's good. We have some diplomats dialing in, it seems, from Canberra. It's always good to see. So I have a question. How do you view the potential role of the EU in the Pacific? Should it align itself closer to the US, or could it be like an alternative partner to the Pacific? Sort of, look beyond military security issues and focus perhaps more on climate and development. So
yeah, the thing that I don't understand, if Germany and France get involved, then what is the role of the EU? And then if the EU does get involved, then what is that? How does that kind of map onto what the Pacific partners are doing? I think it would probably, from the American point of view, I'm sure it would be best if the EU worked with joined as a Pacific partner, and coordinated efforts. But yeah, I really don't have a good read on what the EU is doing so far in the Pacific, but I think that definitely be what America would want, is it for them to join and pool resources and create this sort of block, a bigger block against China.
Talking about China, there's another question. Do you see any scope for US-China cooperation as opposed to confrontation? I mean, on climate change, for example.
Yeah, I wish there was. When COVID, when the COVID pandemic was, creating all this competitive aid delivery between China and other other nations. I really wish that there was some kind of coordination. I think that would be beneficial, but I just don't. It just doesn't seem like at this point in time that there is any kind of coming from the US. I mean, this is what I'm sort of saying, that I think the Pacific might have to, from their perspective, bring people together, and just that they might be able to do it. But I don't think the US has any kind of ability right now to there's no doors that they can open, I don't think, with China right now, but the Pacific might be able to do it. And that would be, just this, incredible. I mean, the leadership that they've shown with climate change, I think they're the ones who can do it. But I don't think the US can. Things are just too toxic at the moment.
Yeah. You'd mentioned the State Department and looking at, I think, investing and putting some more missions. And obviously in Australia, we have a fairly recent new American ambassador, Caroline Kennedy. She was over, I think, in August in Honiara, which was the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Guadalcanal. And she'd met children of Solomon Islanders who'd saved the life of JFK. I don't know if that's just pure coincidence or if there was sort of motive in having her here, whether she'll have a wider remit, but I just, generally, how hollowed out has the State Department become, or how quickly do you think they can sort of redeploy into the region?
Well, they're certainly working on it. That they do realize that this is, really important to get, good people on the ground, to have a very positive face of the US, to really start building relationships and promoting democracy. I mean, a lot of countries in the Pacific, I mean, America's got a real problem also with democracy right now, but a lot of Pacific islands do as well. There's a lot of stress on their democratic institutions. And so I think that, around the region, people are wanting, support of journalists and the judiciary, and, the basic, democratic processes to continue. But as we're seeing that these things are getting, rolled back quite significantly, we're seeing it very clearly in Fiji right now. We've seen it in other places as well. So, I mean, I do think, that you asked about Ambassador Kennedy. I think it's absolutely her part of her outlook to, have a presence in the Pacific, and to have a very different positive. I mean, obviously people are working against the image of America from the Trump times, and I think that that there's a very deliberate attempt to put people out into the region who are, in no way resemble the kind of political face that we had with Donald Trump and people who that he'd sent. Some of whom were good, some of whom weren't. So yeah, I think she's definitely got, she's part of that whole strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Just looking ahead to the midterms, which you'd mentioned a couple of times, and you'd also referred to the low literacy about the Pacific in the US. I mean, how much coverage did the summit actually get domestically?
Well, I think that, most of the major papers have journalists now who are based in the region. I mean, this is something that's happened over the past probably 5 or 6 years, that, the New York Times and other papers have got correspondents in the region. So that's where, that there's this increasing focus on the Pacific. But if I walked out and told someone in the street, that, oh, there was a Pacific summit, they probably wouldn't have paid any attention. It was a discrete, event for a lot of people. the US is, it also happened when Hurricane Ian hit. It was, that was the news last week. That was what everyone was, watching footage of that. And also, obviously Ukraine as well. So, once again, the Pacific is having, it gets a hard time getting coverage because there are always these stories that are sort of bigger and more immediate, more dramatic, televisually, but there is a lot more attention to the Pacific. There certainly is. And I must say, that it's very uneven because in a lot of parts of the United States, you have Pacific communities there, like a whole lot of red states in particular. So you have, very large Marshallese communities in Arkansas. You've got them in Iowa, obviously California and Hawaii as well, which are blue states. But you've got this scattering of Pacifica people around the United States. So you have these pockets where people are more literate because they're, kids are going to school with kids from the Pacific, and that there is this community presence. But again, it's very uneven. So yeah, you can't really speak about. If I say people in Washington aren't paying attention, well, it just depends, if they're in the know or, yes. So yeah, it's very, there's just a lot of things distracting people, but there is certainly people paying attention to the Pacific, and they certainly were watching the summit, even though there were all these other big things happening at the same time.
Well, obviously, Hurricane Ian, as you say, has really put the spotlight on climate change, and that's it. Are you able to talk a little bit more about the commitment that the US was making in the summit itself to addressing climate change in the Pacific?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. The documents, the roadmap documents, there's a lot of things in there. I can't off the top of my head sort of talk about all the different things that they've got in there. There's a lot of different things that they're talking about, different ways of approaching the problem from different perspectives. But yeah, as I said, the problem is what happens if Republicans get into power again, because they really do have they do not want to talk about climate change at all. And there was another really good report today, if anyone's interested in this, a really good report in the Washington Post today about farmers, I think they're in Nebraska, another very deep red state, and about how they're struggling with climate, the effects of climate change, but they don't want to hear about climate change. I know that there's, the Australians have the same, there's a lot of similarities in Australia too, and there's, it's polarizing and it's been politicized. But the, the issue for America now is and Republicans who really do, a lot of them really do support the Pacific, but they will not say anything about climate change. Won't say it, won't talk about it, change the subject is essentially what happens. So they can't do that if they really want to work with the Pacific Islanders. They can't just change the subject because it's such a central part of the whole deal. And I imagine that's another reason why the Biden administration is working so fast. It's also, trying to counter China, but also trying to get some things in place while the first term of the Biden administration is, there's some time, not much, but there is time. So I think that's also, another reason for the haste.
Yes, no, I understand. And I suppose, the administration needs to demonstrate as well that it's a genuine engagement with the Pacific nations rather than purely just trying to counter China and one wonders how the Pacific Islands will hold them to account. But I'm not. I mean, I didn't follow it closely enough. But what are the next steps? Do you see this summit becoming a regular type of event? Have they set any future date, or is it a bit of a one-off?
I haven't. I mean, I think it would be a good idea to do it again, to have it as a regular event, or to make the pickle not a 3-year event, but something more regular as well. I think that they're going to have to do something along those lines, but not just have a talk fest, but have actual on the ground changes, things that are really obvious, that things are working, that the US is really delivering. So the pressure is really on now to sort of come up with the goods, that there's been all the talking, there's been all the pledges, but they really need to come up with things very quickly. And I think that that's going to be the next big challenge. Like, how are they going to demonstrate that the US is back?
Yeah,
absolutely. And to stay, and will stay, and not just go, not sort of withdraw again as they have before.
Yeah, that will actually be the proof of the pudding in the eating, as they say. So, Patty, I think that it pretty much brings us to our hour. We have lots of questions. I mean, this is really excellent. I think we should do more early morning webinars here.
Oh, really? Oh, good.
Yeah, lots of introductions.
Coffee, good.
We've pretty much, excuse me, covered all the issues. But so just leaves me, I think, to say thank you to the Zoom audience for dialing in and your interest. And Patty, thank you so much for taking part, for putting that excellent presentation together. A lot of work gone into that, very informative. Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure having you on, and we are all now much better informed.
Thank you very much. And anytime anyone wants, to contact me, talk about the Pacific, just send me an email.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed. We'll be in touch, and we'll sign off from here. So I'm just going to put up our final closing slide, and we will see you all later. So thank you all, and have a good day.